Please take a seat. So today, the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization is presenting the third in the series of Armenian lectures in Armenian studies that are generously sponsored by Romanian Endowed. So we are privileged to have this opportunity to at least have 2 or 3 lectures a year in Armenian studies here at the University of Chicago, where it shows, it is a kind of a display of Armenian culture, history, and anything else that Armenian studies can offer. So it's like different layers of Armenian studies that could be presented here. And for that reason, we are inviting one of the best professors nationwide to present any aspect of Armenian studies. So today, this will be the 3rd one in that series. And just a reminder that the lecture is being recorded because Mrs. Hovannisian asked a recording to be sent to her. So if anyone is shy or intimidated, you can just be silent, not ask a question. But otherwise, of course, you can leave your footprint or with your question. So I'm very happy to see you all here. So I will give the podium to Hripsime, who is, I guess, the head of the Romanian committee, as well as the director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies.
Good evening, everyone. I know that you're anxious to get to the main event, so I'll try not to expatiate too much. But I do want to say several things. First of all, of course, as Haroutunian already mentioned, we're extremely grateful to the Romanian family for supporting Armenian studies at the University of Chicago broadly, and specifically for supporting this series of lectures, as well as the position of the Romanian visiting professorship, which in the past, our tonight's distinguished speaker has also held that position in prior years. So I just want to say that I'm delighted on behalf of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations to welcome everybody here tonight. I want to thank the fellow members of my committee for working with the Armenian Studies program here, which includes John Lewis, who is Professor John has long been an advocate for Armenian studies and has been active with this program for many years. An advocate for Armenian studies here on this campus, I'm going to say. Professor Shamsi, and of course, Professor Haroutunian, who really is the heart and soul of the Armenian studies program here at the University of Chicago, and who always is a tireless supporter and initiator in this field of labor. So I want to particularly thank you for all their efforts. And it's my pleasure this evening to welcome Professor Sebouh Aslanian, who comes to us from the UCLA Department of History, where he is associate professor and also the Hripsime Endowed Chair of Modern Armenian History. And it's my particular pleasure to do so, both because he's an extraordinarily distinguished scholar, and also because he's an old friend and we've had a variety of fun times over the years. And so it's always good to mix business and pleasure where possible. I think everybody here may very well know that a few years ago he published, in 2011 in fact, he published a book that was groundbreaking in its nature and the recipient of many awards and prizes, including the Penn Literary Award for the most outstanding first book, and a book that was also chosen by the Committee of the California World History Library to be the first volume in their series. And it was called From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants from Julfa. Now, there are a lot of things that are wonderful about this book, but just to mention one or two, I think one thing that can't be overstressed is the scope, the vast geographical range that incorporates really from the Mediterranean shores of Europe all the way to the Indian Ocean, crossing the Ottoman Empire and Iran. It's also worth noting that it required extraordinary linguistic capabilities to be able to deal with the documents that stand at the heart of that volume, and that he had to handle things that not just any person, it's not just because you could read Armenian, for example, that you could read those documents. So mastering all of the particular languages of Julfa and the Julfa merchants and delving into those commercial networks was a real accomplishment, obviously. And of course, it introduced new ways of thinking about merchant networks, in the sense of, instead of focusing on the notion of diasporas or merchant diasporas, it really tried to focus on the idea, which now maybe in the age of the internet seems more familiar, but was pretty innovative then, focusing on the idea of circulation societies and networks as an organizing principle for how these communities work. So it was and remains a very important book and a kind of monument in the field of not only Armenian studies, but the study of early modern Europe and of the development of trade on a global scale. So it's pretty exciting to have somebody so distinguished here to give a lecture. I'll just mention briefly also that he's working on two new projects at the same time, because as a famous or infamous American would said, make no small plans. One of those is a book which he has tentatively entitled Global Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities and Printers in the Armenian Diaspora, 1512 to 1800, which really examines the development of print culture among Armenians. At the time when print culture, of course, was developing in many communities, but sort of understanding the specific and important role that the Armenian print culture had in that process, and looking at it again in this global perspective and not sort of focused on localized communities. And also, I understand that he's working on another volume called Voyage of the Catalina, a global micro-history of the early modern Indian Ocean, which examines an enormous collection of primary documents that he discovered while he was working on the earlier book. It has to do with the history, the trade history, shall we say, of the Catalina, which was an ocean-going trade vessel engaged in long-ocean commerce, and which will, I think, provide a fascinating insight into how international commerce worked. And so, having labored on for a good long time, it's my pleasure to give you Professor Sebouh.
Well, thank you very much, Oli. That was one of the most generous introductions I've received. I'm afraid that, given the fact that I'm both tired and have been introduced in such a fashion, I'm only bound to disappoint. So I apologize for that. I'd like to thank also Hripsime, Dr. Haroutunian, for inviting me here today, the Dumanyan family for being generous enough to and farsighted enough to have this lecture series, as well as the professorship, of which I was a beneficiary about 9 years ago or so. And I must also say that it's a pleasure to be back in Chicago. I lived here for 1/4, 99 or so years ago, and I still remember many of the streets, so it's a nice familiar feeling to be back here, despite the rain. So, with all that said, let me jump straight to my talk. My talk is entitled, obviously, A Ship with Two Rudders. I hope the title will become evident as the lecture progresses. And it's about essentially the global trade networks of one particular New Julfan family known as the Koja Guerak-Mirman family, which had a tentacular kind of expansion across the width, the breadth of Eurasia, and were multilingual, multi-religious, and truly cosmopolitans in the modern sense of the term in some ways. So, on the 22nd of the month of Hamira, in the year 1131 of the Greater Armenian calendar, and the year 67 of the calendar of Azariah, that is to say, December 7th, 1682, a young Armenian left his hometown of New Julfa and embarked on an ambitious voyage to the east. His name was Hovannisian. Hovhannis, at the time of his travels, was carrying with him some English broadcloth, a little cash, a bill of exchange, one of many to come, for which he expected to be paid in cash on his way down to Bandar Abbas, the port on the Persian Gulf, where he hoped to hop on an Armenian-owned vessel called the Suleimani on his maiden voyage to the Persian Gulf, to the Indian port of Surat on the northwestern armpit of India. Over the next 15 years, Hovhannis would crisscross the northern India, purchasing commodities and engaging in complex transactions and noting everything down in his double entry accounting ledger, and living in multiple locations across northern India and far-flung places including Delhi, Aurangabad, Calcutta, Patna, and Agra, to name only a few. Whenever he sold or purchased commodities, he made sure to note the exact nature of his transaction in his double entry accounting ledger called a Ruzname or Ruznama, which is a daily accounting ledger, double entry, and which he kept with him at all times wherever he traveled. Unfortunately for us, unfortunately for him, and quite fortunately for us, sometime in 1692, after his return from spending 5 continuous years in the Tibetan capital of Lhasa, where he lived 2 years less than Brad Pitt in the famous movie 7 Years in Tibet, he lost track of his double entry accounting and essentially probably had to pay for it in some form or another to his masters back home, about which I will talk in a second. So wherever he went, Hovhannis was greeted by fellow Armenian merchants whose trade diaspora communities spanned a wide arc across northern India, in many locations, including some that I've mentioned, as well as north to Kathmandu and Tibet. So Hovhannis's journeys, of course, did not take place in a vacuum, nor were they without significant support. Behind his complex movements, his sophisticated transactions in his accounting ledger, lay the activities of his masters, the capitalist masters who were in New Julfa, Isfahan, and whose names were Zakaria and Emdrum Agha, who belonged to the Guerak-Mirman family of New Julfa. So who were these merchants? And how did their family firms' expansion across much of Eurasia and from Lhasa, Tibet, all the way west across the Mediterranean to Venice, Livorno, Genoa, and including Madrid and Alicante in Spain, how did this expansion mirror the larger expansion on the Julfan trade network in which this family blossomed? This is one of the questions that I'd like to respond today in a way of focusing on a micro-historical study of this one family and relying on multiple archives, many of which, if not the majority, have been unconsulted or little known or studied, stored in archives such as the Archivio di Stato in northern Italy in Venice, the Archivio di Stato di Venezia, the Archivio di Stato of Florence, the Archivio di Stato of I think those two will suffice for the time being, as well as archives in New Julfa, Yerevan, and a few other locations. And relying on these documents, I hope to be showing you, I hope to be talking about the history of this family and using this family as a kind of micro-historical lens to look at the larger phenomenon of the phenomenal expansion of the Julfa network during this period that world historians call the early modern period. Towards the end of my talk, I will return finally to examining the question of religion and its uses or roles in this family's expansion across this network. What role did their relationship, ambivalent as it was to Catholicism, play in their expansion across the European networks in the Mediterranean? And how did this, in some ways, what does their adherence to Catholicism say about the larger phenomenon of the age of confessionalization during the early modern period, about which also I will talk during the conclusion of the talk. So these are my general talks, my general points. I should have mentioned this earlier. This is the ledger that Hovannisian lost in Calcutta. Fortunately for us, it was discovered 300 or so years later at the National Library of Lisbon, where in 1965, the nephew or cousin of Calouste Gulbenkian, the world's wealthiest man at some point in the 1920s, I think, Roberto Gulbenkian, who was a first-class Sunday historian, better than many professional historians that I know of. He came across this ledger in the library of the National Library of Portugal and immediately sent a microfilm copy to the Matenataran in Yerevan, the manuscriptorium in Yerevan, where the founder of the Matenataran, the formidable Levon Hachigian, and his perhaps equally formidable assistant and partner, Hago Papazian, labored, travailed on this manuscript of only 50, 60 pages in length, probably maybe even less, for no less than 23 years until they published the contents of this famous ledger. Right here in 1982 or 83. It's a monument, it's a real monument to scholarship, and sadly, it has, because of the complexity of the language and the difficulties of the transactions that it contained, it hasn't been really studied. I don't think anyone has actually seriously delved deep into this work. But it is thanks to this that we know about the family's early history, and thanks to this work that we know much about the early period of Julfan expansion across the Indian Ocean. This is the family insignia of the Guerak-Mirman family. I should have pointed out earlier. So let me skip ahead and provide some basic words of context about the larger history of the Julfan network, the macro picture, so to speak, from which I will then shift to a more micro analysis of this one family and examine their relationship. Much of what I have to say, as Holly very generously pointed out, is based on my first book, and you can see the title on the cover page here. So if some of you have heard this before, I apologize for the repetitious nature of it, but it is important in the sense of giving context to the talk. It is important that we go over some of these, some of this background context. So the larger world that made the family of Guerak-Mirman's firm, the family firm of Guerak-Mirman thrive and succeed, of course, is the world of the Julfa network. And the Julfa network, in many ways, begins its origins in this small town, in the outskirts of the Safavid imperial capital of Isfahan, right around there. I don't have a pointer for some reason, it's not working. Where in the early years of the 1600s, as a result of Safavid Iranian expansion, simultaneously to the expansion of the other gunpowder empire of the period, namely the Ottomans, these two empires came to bump up against each other in the frontier zone of these of the South Caucasus and southeastern Asia Minor, or Anatolia as it is called. When they bumped up against each other in 1603, 1604, the Iranian Safavid ruler Shah Abbas I launched a kind of surprise attack on the Ottomans to regain territory that his ancestors had lost. And in the course of this war against the Safavids, he proceeded to capture Nakhichevan in the north, Yerevan, and then he came across the town of Old Julfa on the outskirts on the frontier zone of these two empires, where the New Julfan merchants' forefathers originated. And in the context of this war, around 1603, 1604, news reached the Persian ruler, the Safavid ruler, that the Ottoman armies were on their way from the west, and he quickly panicked and he decided to retreat before the Ottomans advanced on him. And in the process of retreating, he resorted to an age-old tactic of war known as the scorched earth policy, essentially razing the entire region to the ground and not leaving anything to the advancing Ottoman armies, and in the process, violently removing the population of the frontier region so that they wouldn't be of any use to the advancing forces. As a result, somewhere around 300,000 people, majority of them Armenians, but also including Kurds and others, were removed from their homes and forcibly marched into Iran, where they were resettled in diverse parts of the Safavid domains. The Shah was particularly focused and beneficent towards this one small town of Old Julfa on the frontier zone, whose merchants had come into prominence already by the 1560s, 50, 60 years before their forced deportations, displacement, and relocations. They had come to the notice of many European merchants during this time because they had a monopoly, or not a monopoly, but a significant hold on the export and sale of Iran's most important commodity, and the second most important commodity, arguably, in the global economy at that time, that is to say, raw silk. These merchants were almost the near exclusive purveyors of raw silk to European merchants in places such as Aleppo and Iskender and so on, and Bursa at some point. So, in the eastern fringes of the Mediterranean. But their success and fame had not only reached the ears of European merchants and also cartographers. Their town, Old Julfa, was mentioned on one of the first atlases ever published, Ortelius's atlas, where this small, insignificant backwater place deserved a place on this larger map, indicating the prominence of its merchants and their role in this kind of burgeoning global economy. So, but therefore, their fame did not only reach these Europeans, it also reached the ears of the Safavid rulers, particularly Shah Abbas I, who, in the course of this campaign against the Ottomans, decided to be particularly, relatively, I should say, generous to the merchants of Old Julfa, a town of no more than 10 to 15,000 people, mostly merchants. There was no agriculture in the area and so on. And so he decided to give them a privileged treatment by relocating them not to the self-producing regions north here on the southern shores of the Caspian Sea, where many Armenians reported there died of various illnesses and so on, epidemics, but instead he moved them down and settled them on the outskirts of his newly built imperial capital, Isfahan, where before too long he granted them from the court's own private kind of coffers in land. This area south of the river Zayande, the Zayande route as it's known, where these migrants who were merchants with specialized skills settled down. And of course, they renamed this area, which was given as a gift to them, New Julfa, in memory of their evacuated town. Before too long, by 1618, they completed an auction. They were given the right to have a near exclusive monopoly of the trade of Iran's most important commodity. And so, with this monopoly behind them, and with the strong support and aid of the Safavid dynasty, particularly Abbas I, they launched a global kind of trade network that spanned across the world, covering all the major empires of the early modern period, including the empires that historians nowadays call the whale empires, that is to say, the seaborne empires of the Europeans, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the English, the Spanish, the French, and so forth. The Chofins are operating in all of their maritime empires, as well as the land-based elephant empires, especially the formidable Gandhara empire of the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, my favorite empire. So, before too long, they were operating in all these empires, plus Russia in the north, as well as Qing China in the east. So, and they built this global trade network with settlements that span from London, Amsterdam, and Cadiz in the far west, all the way across Europe, the Mediterranean, Russia, the Middle East, the Near East, Mughal India, and as far east as Guangzhou, China, and Manila on the mouth of the Pacific Ocean, the Spanish colonial outpost. They ran this kind of global network, for the most part, from this building inside this compound here. For the most part, this is at first glance, it looks very much like a mosque. But upon closer inspection, it turns out to be a cathedral, a Christian Armenian cathedral, which was the heart of the New Julfan community. And in many ways, for me at least, this building, and I use this example all the time in my classes, is a kind of excellent kind of simile for the larger Julfan network. On the surface, it resembles and accommodates itself to a larger world of Islamicate. Iran, Persianate Iran, the architecture is very Islamicate. The language of these merchants was also in many ways Islamicate, if one could use that term for the language, or Persianate at the very least. It had multiple languages inside of it, including Persian, Arabic, Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, Hindustani, a little sprinkle of Tibetan, thanks to Hovannisian, and a few other languages all mixed into this unique dialect of Mercantile Armenian, which is no longer written or spoken today. As far as I know, the Mercantile version at least went out of use, became extinct in the late 19th century for complicated reasons. But this network has left behind tens of thousands of documents on commercial transactions and so on, using this particular dialect, which is certainly not like reading the New York Times. Even if one is fluent in Armenian, one will be very hard pressed to understand it. It takes years and years of training, and even then, I've been trying to read these documents for 15, 18 years or so, and I can't say that there isn't a day that goes by when I don't feel defeated by some of the documents, because it depends on which document you're looking at. In any case, so how did these merchants manage to maintain a larger kind of integrity of this network that was global in scope for over 140, 150 years? To explain, to answer this question, I relied on the work of French colleague and friend called Markovits, who devised this notion of networks and circulation to explain how trade networks function, and I've tweaked this model a little bit, but essentially when you're using a trade network, for a trade network to function, it needs to have nodes, and it needs to have above all else what he calls the circulation of men and things. And of course, by the circulation of men and things, what he means, and what I mean in this context, is the circulation of merchants in the form of commenda agents like Hovannisian, and the circulation of priests to staff the churches that the Julfans had in the east, particularly managed by the center of the Julfan network in Isfahan, and so forth. I'll come back to this in more detail in a second. So, across this larger, I want to go back for a second to the component parts of this larger Julfan network that was presided over by the merchants in New Julfa. And I want to say that essentially it had 4 circuits across a very wide space that were interlocked to each other and connected to each other through their relationship to what I call the nodal center of the larger global network. The nodal center was, of course, the township of New Julfa. And it had 4 circuits. The first circuit, of course, is the most important circuit in my view, the Indian Ocean circuit of settlements, where we have numerous nodes. These are the settlements known as nodes, and most of them, as you can see on this map, are actually clustered in the area of South Asia or Mughal India. Of course, it's not accidental that most of the settlements are there. They're there because Mughal India, perhaps next to China, was the wealthiest empire in the world at some point, and a place that attracted not only famous and gifted Persian poets from Iran who flocked to the courts in South Asia in quest of employment, but also attracted Armenian merchants from Iran. And so you can see here New Julfan settlements controlled by the nodal center right here in Isfahan, New Julfa, and consisting of Madras in the south, Calcutta to the northeast, Surat right here, Hovannisian's destination point on his maiden voyage, Pondicherry, the French outpost, Chandernagor, also French, and a wide variety of other places. And of course, within this larger world of the Indian Ocean, there's of course the outpost of Lhasa, where there was an Armenian community from Julfa that resided there from 1660 to 1770, and which Hovannisian, when he arrived there, sometime in the early 1690s for a 5-year stay. Late 1680s, early 1690s. But beyond this, we have Julfan settlements, of course, in Canton or Guangzhou, China, right here in the middle of the Philippines, right here on the edge of the Pacific Ocean, and a whole host of later settlements in the 19th century that emerged for the most part in the early 1800s as a result of continued Julfan activity in this region. We had important settlements in Rangoon, which still has a church to this day. Today's Yangon, or what used to be known as Burma before, but Dhaka here also has a church. You can still visit it if you're interested. I think they're building a museum of some sort there. And Singapore, of course, somewhere around here, is also a Julfan circuit. So that's one circuit. The next circuit went north to across Russia. We have important settlements in Astrakhan, very important, significant Julfan outpost with 3,000 Julfans, which is astronomically large figure compared to other settlements of the Julfan network. We have Kazan, Moscow, Archangel, St. Petersburg, and so on. And then, of course, the Mediterranean circuit to the west here, from Aleppo, Iskenderun, to Izmir, Constantinople, Istanbul, Split, which, interestingly enough, has a few Julfa dialect documents that I discovered through a student, graduate student, who was kind enough to share them with me at the archives in Dubrovnik. And, of course, my favorite city of all time in the galaxy, Venice, and the world. And then lastly, we have Julfa settlements at Marseille, Cadiz here, and on the periphery of the point of articulation where the Indian Ocean, where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic Ocean. Julfans are also settled in Paris, in London, in Amsterdam, where they had a very important center for printing books, the most important center for the Armenians of the early modern period. So, and as I was saying earlier, these four circuits were connected to each other through the center of New Julfa, and kept together more or less intact for over 140 years through the constant circulation of men and things, particularly the circulation of merchants in the form of low-level agents who worked for their masters, for their khojas, the capitalist masters who were, for the most part, stationary and who lived in these incredible abodes in Isfahan or New Julfa. These circulating agents were people like Hovannisian, who went off for 20 years, sometimes 15, 20 years, and then returned home and submitted their double entry accounting ledger to their masters. They usually worked on a partnership contract, as a result of which they only kept 25% of the profit that they made. They did all the work but kept a small fragment of it, which was, in retrospect, for them a very good deal because many of them didn't have any cash or any capital or credit to start off on their own. In any case, then we have circulation of priests, and most importantly, the circulation of women. I should say very few circulation of information. Very few women circulated in the network. I've only come across a handful of them. They're mostly, if they are circulating across the network, they're circulating in the capacity of wives to very wealthy Julfan, not commander agents, but people, very wealthy merchants themselves, khojas, who decide to also work for other places in the Indian Ocean. So, for the most part, this is, whether we like it or not, this is a man's work. The Julfa network was incredibly patriarchal. I mean, it makes some of the worst patriarchies that we witness today pale in comparison in terms of how much it was dominated by patriarchy and by a kind of agnatic family firm, which was the basic substructure, the social structure of the Julfa network. So, just to give you an idea of the extent of this network and what it might look like from the point of view of a circulating commander agent like Hovannisian, but in this case, not Hovhannis, but two agents that I've come across in my work in the Inquisition archives in Mexico City, the National Archives in Mexico. Two particular individuals jumped out at me in terms of their global cosmopolitan nature of their movements and mobility across the network. These are Santiago de Barranquilla, who's marked in red here, he's all over the place, and Gregorio de Zacarias, who's also pretty much all over the place, but not quite as ambitious as Santiago. Santiago was everywhere, including Malta, and I can't imagine how anyone would be able to conduct this kind of life at a time before time-space compression, before globalization, before container ships, before jet airline travel, and so forth. This is basically someone who's traveling, like many of the other Julfans, on yaks, on camels, on sail ships, of course, sailboats, and so forth. So it takes a lot of grit to do this if you're in the 17th century and you belong to this network. So now I'm going to stop for a second and ask a series of general questions in terms of how the general information I've provided thus far about the Julfan network, which gives you a broad macro picture of how it operated, how it can stand, how it stands scrutiny if it is viewed from a different perspective, not a large-scale macro perspective, but a micro perspective, and in this case, the perspective of one family. in this family form, of course, is the family from the Guerak-Mirman, the Guerak-Mirmans with whom I began this talk. So, the Guerak-Mirman, or simply Mirman family, was one of the wealthiest founding families of New Julfa. Some of whose members, but not all, were Catholic Armenians, and this part is an important part. The family is perhaps most well known, as we saw, because of the travel ledger that got lost in Calcutta, and on the basis of which we know so much the late 17th century history of the Indian Ocean and of the history of the Julfan community in particular. According to Mesro Uhurlian, a priest at the Armenian church of Livorno, where one branch of the family had settled in the 17th century, in his account of the history of the community of Armenians in Livorno and the building of the church there, Mesro Uhurlian basically devotes a long chapter to this, one of the pillars of the community, the Guerak-Mirman family, and argues that they had a reputation already in the 17th century for being of noble lineage. Some very wealthy Julfan families in Italy particularly passed themselves off as noblemen. We don't know whether they're actually really noblemen in terms of belonging to ancient Armenian Nakhara clans or nobility, but certainly they saw themselves as nobility, and they had other people believe in the way that they staged themselves as far as their nobility is concerned. So according to Urian, the earliest background, the earliest kind of member of the family that we know about, lived in the ancient former Armenian capital of Ani, where in 1366 he appears, and his name is Alaverdi. In 1366. The family traced its origin back to the Byzantine period, and of course also to Cilician Armenia, where they argued they were noblemen as well. But the earliest known document that we have of this family is the presence of Guerak-Mirman in Ani in 1366. Guerak-Mirman, of course, as this family tree shows you here, is a family tree that the descendants of the family donated to Madanataran about 2 years ago. So it dates from the early 1700s. So Guerak-Mirman had three sons. Of these, three sons who branched out in three respective directions by the end of the 14th century. One branch, under the guidance of Guerak-Mirman, settled in Poland. The second branch, brother of Gregory, the son of Alaverdi, Hovannisian, settled in Georgia, and yet a third son, Aslanian of Alaverdi, decided not to go to Poland or Georgia, but to move down to this location south of Ani, at the time pretty much a backwater area, which later on turned out to be Old Julfa. So it is that branch, the Aslanian branch, that we owe this history of the Guerak-Mirman family. From that branch, shortly after Aslanian's, some generations after Aslanian's migration to Old Julfa, one of his descendants, known as Guerak-Mirman again, was among the refugees who were plucked violently by Shah Abbas I and forcibly moved to Isfahan in 1604. Within a very short period after their relocation to New Julfa, the Guerak-Mirman family, that who also lived in a particular neighborhood of their own, New Julfa was divided into 20 different districts, neighborhoods, and each one was named after the wealthiest family there. They had their own neighborhood, they patronized their own church, and so forth. So shortly afterwards, after moving to New Julfa, Guerak-Mirman's sons themselves decided to repeat the family tradition of dispersion and decided to bifurcate the family again between eastern and western branches. One branch left. They patronize this church. This is the Church of St. Mary in Julfa, which has also a painting that was commissioned by them, a wall painting done in Venice. This is Guerak-Mirman, I think one of the patriarch of the family. And so one branch of the family in the mid 1600s moved permanently to Surat and Calcutta. In Surat, the most important member of this branch is this person here, Owen John D. Guerak, whose tombstone is in the Surat cemetery and was one of the earlier tombstones that I deciphered and translated. He died in 1795, and he's very important because he was, like other members of the family, an incredible patron for the arts and literature. He single-handedly bankrolled the newly founded Armenian colony of Hripsime on Rostov-na-Don, a colony founded in 1776 by the primate of Russia, the Armenian primate of Russia, Haroutunian, whose nickname was Longomano, or as he was known in Armenian, Yerkaina Bazuk. So he, Guerak-Mirman, Owen John, son of Guerak, basically bankrolled the colony of Hripsime. He paid for the printing press of Hripsime. He also paid for the printing of numerous books in Echmiadzin as well. Very devoted, staunch supporter of the Armenian Apostolic Church. The second branch of the family, however, son of Guerak-Mirman, Gregorio Guerak-Mirman, in the 1640s moved his base permanently to Italy, where he was sent as an emissary of the Shah, and where he settled down in Venice and Livorno as early as the 1650s or 1640s. By 1660, he was the official representative of Shah Suleiman in Italy, while his other brother was the official representative of the Shah in the East. And as a result of his commerce, he became very wealthy. You can see him here. And in 1687, the reason why he's important personally for me is because in 1687, he wrote his last will and testament and left a huge fortune for the building of Venice's phenomenal Armenian church known as Santa Croce degli Armeni, or Sut Khach Heights, which is in the neighborhood behind Piazza San Marco. It's in a maze-like area of little alleys that takes you a while to discover, but it's a beautiful, gorgeous church, and it's particularly resonant for me because 2 days, 15 years ago, essentially 15 years ago, my wife and I got married in this church. So it has a kind of special meaning for me. Anyway, so Gregorio founded this church, and you can see him here. He left behind several medals that he had specially designed for him in Amsterdam. And there he is standing. It's not a very good picture, but it gives you an idea of what he looked like, if you can see. Like many other Julfa merchants, he looked very Islamic, right? He's wearing Muslim headgear, at least on the surface. The turban is very, very, very much a sign of distinction from the East. His sartorial customs, like all Julfa merchants, were Eastern and so on, and yet he had converted to Catholicism and made sure that the church he built was a Catholic Armenian church. We know much about this branch of the family. We don't know that much about the internal commercial operations of the Indian branch, about whom I've done a lot of research, but only in the capacity of patrons of arts and, let's say, benefactors of printing and publishing of books. But in terms of economic history, the Indian branch has left behind virtually no documents. On the contrary, the Venetian branch has left, Venetian and Livorno branch have left hundreds and hundreds of documents scattered in archives, including particularly this one important book, It's a kind of printed stampa book of 200 pages that chronicles the history of the family from 1677 to the middle of the 18th century, and it's all written in Italian because several generations, 2 generations after the passing of Guerak-Mirman, the family essentially assimilated, and they couldn't read the documents anymore. They had lost touch with their Armenian heritage, the language, the dialect, but they had the foresight to have someone translate all the family's important papers into easily understandable Italian, and as a result of which we're able to actually know quite a bit about the commercial operations of the Guerak-Mirmans within the realm of Italy and the European region of the Julfa. So here we have this stampa folder, which has not just names of their Comenda agents, as I mentioned. You can see here, I don't have a magnifying glass, but you can see here that these are the 22 or so factors of Comenda agents who worked for the Guerak-Mirman family. It's a middle-sized range. Some families have up to 50, but that doesn't necessarily determine the wealth of the family. But here, you can't see it, but at the top there, I think the 12th, I'm not sure, no, the 15th Comenda agent is listed in Italian as Hovannisian di Don Davide, and that is none other than Hovannisian del Tafian, who went to Tibet and his ledger got lost in Calcutta. So, let me turn to the will of Gregorio Guerak-Mirman to see what it can tell us about his commercial success as well as his religious kind of affiliations or ties. The will was written in 1686, 1687, a year before he died, and lists his wealth in detail, and at one point, somewhere around here, where it says "Ritrovandomi ave acquistata con me denari," he says here, I'll translate, says, finding myself having purchased with my own money a house here in Venice, in San Basso, and 2 in Livorno, along with a ranch or estate, in Podere, that was given to me as a fief by the Grand Duke of Tuscany. My wish and will is that these properties remain under the perpetual possession of the firstborn male after the firstborn, who will be born from Haroutun, of course, Haroutun is written here, my youngest son, and that shall be born from the children of Haroutun, with the following proviso, that they shall always be called Gregorio di Guerak-Mirman. And if this lineage lacks any male offspring, then the property shall go to the male children of my other older son, with the same conditions if they have male children. Otherwise, if this land were also not to issue male children, the property should go to the descendants of my brothers. So, it's, as I mentioned, this is a very patriarchal network, very patriarchal society. The system that holds it together, the group that binds the social network together, is called the agnatic system. The agnatic families are the building blocks of this network. So basically, families ruled by the eldest patriarchal male of each generation, who rules over his brothers, families, and so on. And property is held in common. They usually have religion in common in the old Nakharar days. This is a system that goes back to the pre-Christian days of Armenia. It's something that is inherited by the Julfans, probably from the Arsacids, the Ashakuni, or the Parthian rulers of Armenia, who were originally from the Trans-Oxanian region. So it's a kind of special type of social structure that has its advantages in some ways, but also severe disadvantages in terms of business. But despite these disadvantages, the Julfans seem to succeed very well, even with this archaic structure in place. So the patriarchal nature of this man's inheritance, of course, the way he shared his wealth, in some ways is a misfortune, particularly for the only surviving member of the family today, whose name is Manuela Salvini. It's a she, and I don't suppose she received much, but she is from this family, and it's her donation to the Mabenataran that has allowed us to know so much about this family, about the family tree and the notebook of letters going back to the early 1700s. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't complain about his proviso that every son had to be named, every firstborn male son had to be named Gregorio the Guerak-Mirman after himself, because it creates a lot of confusion for historians, as narcissistic as it may be for the person. So we have to be careful as to which Gregorio it is. But so what about this? And here I'll show you the house that he mentioned. He owned at a time when most Julfas in Venice rented apartments in various districts of Venice, particularly in the San Marco district and so on, and weren't all wealthy. This family, along with the other family, the wealthiest family in Venice, another Catholic family, as it turns out also from Julfa, the Hripsime family, owned their own houses. And his home that he mentions in his book is right here in San Basso. I found that after numerous attempts at navigating the nerve-like kind of alleys of the area behind San Marco, and it's either here or in the building right across from here. One of these it's a three or four story house that he left to his children. He also had a ranch as well. So now let me go back and conclude by looking at the religious dimension of the will. So he states in the formulaic introduction of the world praising God for his long life and so forth, and talking about the property that he's going to leave behind, the wealth, he makes sure that he leaves the lion's share of his wealth for the community of the Armenians in Venice, and he specifically requests that the church be built. Of course, the church was being built beforehand, before he opened his will, and be built to the benefit of our nation of Armenian Catholics. So, a beneficio della nostra nazione armena cattolica. So he was a Catholic man. Or was he? Of course, we don't know for sure. But we know that according to this one document that I've come across in the Propaganda Fide archives in the series known as Armeni, Volume 3, Folio 179, a priest from Livorno who was working as a snitch for the Propaganda Fide in Rome, writes to the cardinals saying that there is a man here, an Armenian, who claims to be a devout Catholic, but he has been secretly sending letters to his hometown and informing the primate of his hometown of all those Catholics, all those Armenians in Livorno who have been tempted to convert to Catholicism, so that their properties be confiscated in Iman. And so when I first read this, it was a very interesting kind of report. I thought this can't be Gregorio. Mirman is a very devout Catholic and so forth. And then, as a result of thinking about this whole question of religion and what it meant to be a Catholic and an Armenian in the 8th, 17th century, having taught a seminar last year on religious dissimulation and imposters in the early modern period, people who went around claiming to be others and so forth, or people who claim to be of one religion but really deep inside, because they were forced to convert to other religions, held some form of allegiance to their original religion. And of course, by this I mean to say particularly 3 or 4 major communities. I'm talking particularly about the Iberian Jewry, who were forcibly converted to Catholicism as a result of the erection of the establishment of the Inquisition in 1478, and subsequently either had a choice of leaving Iberia or converting and staying, and many of them chose to convert, who came from the so-called, also known as Marranos, who were externally Catholics, they followed Catholic tradition and so forth, but maintained an allegiance to their original faith. The same is also the case with the Muslim community of Iberia, known as Moriscos. They're not talked about as much, but they also were forcibly converted. They also practiced religious dissimulation in the form of taqiyya, and converted to Catholicism, but maintained deep inside an allegiance to their Muslim faith. The same is also the case in the early modern period of other communities, including those that are referred to as Nicodemites in Italy and in Northern Europe. That is to say, those who are Catholics living under Protestant countries, Protestant rule, and who, because of convenience and force, are compelled to externally follow a tradition, but internally maintain some kind of allegiance to their original faith. Catholics did this in Protestant countries, Protestants did this in Catholic countries. So this is an age of widespread religious dissimulation where people's religious identities cannot be taken at face value, and of course this created much anxiety and fear and suspicion across Europe, particularly on the part of the Catholic Church. Hence the letter here, and there are many such letters in the Propaganda archives where Armenian informants are basically telling on each other that this person is not really a Catholic, he's actually deep down inside, he's a heretic, he's an Armenian. Of course, I mean, the Armenian Church is a heretical, schismatic church at this time. And so the question arises as to what extent this is also the case with the Guerak-Mirman family. One branch, as we've seen in Surah, was devoutly apostolic. They not only supported the Armenian Church and colonies, the colony of Hovannisian, but they purposefully patronized the publication of books, religious books, that were meant to be a kind of bulwark against the continuous work and potential rival threat of Catholicism as seen from the point of view of the Armenian Church. As late as the 1780s, confessional strife was very much alive in the Armenian community. And so, if one branch is a staunch supporter of the Apostolic Church, and yet the Guerak-Mirman branch in Venice and Livorno are Catholics, and they stipulate that the church they want is a Catholic church, they don't have a choice, first of all. The church in Venice has to be a Catholic church. Same with Livorno. And so it raises the question whether this person converted for reasons that were rather instrumental. And I would probably think that this was more likely the case than a more kind of sincere conversion, although it's very difficult to know to what extent someone might have converted to religion or not on the question of sincerity alone. So here I'll read a very quick comment by John Martin, who wrote an essay on Marranos and Nicodemites in Venice in the 16th century and focused on one particular Marrano merchant whose name was Gaspar Ribiera, who was brought before the Inquisition in the 1570s, I think 1570, in front of the Venetian Inquisition, and tried with heresy and so on. And one of the local informants or witnesses, who was a Jew, testifying that this person is not what he appears to be. He said, this person is a ship with two rudders. He puts on one rudder during sail in a particular direction, and removes it and replaces it with another rudder for another direction. And so, of course, it's a question of asking if there were two rudder Julfans in Italy or in other places. We know for sure that in Mexico there was widespread fear of some Julfans, one or two who were there being actually at least two rudder. And here, let me read a very quick passage from this excellent essay by John Martin, where he says not only about he talks about the two rudder nature of Gaspar Ribiera, but also talks about how in this period there was a lot of hybridization going on in the religions, and he says, talking about the Marranos, they participated in Catholic observances, but it is by no means clear that they follow that they followed or followed exclusively the teachings of Rome. To the contrary, a significant minority of men and women in its early modern city may have only put on a mask of Catholicism, or they were Catholic in a complicated way, simultaneously holding the beliefs and observing the practices of other faiths. So, lest one think that this is an exceptional case of Guerak-Mirman being accused of being a man with a ship with two rudders, according to this spy report, I'll read a passage from a two-volume work called The Chronicle of Carmelites, which has very detailed information on Armenians in Julfa and on questions of religion as well, particularly. And one of the Catholic monks there, who's quoted, says, "All Armenians coming to Italy, and particularly to Rome, deceive your holiness in the cardinals. There they give themselves out to be Catholics, and here, there's the same Julfa, they are the greatest persecutors of the missionaries and of the true Catholics." Lastly, a report from the Inquisition methods in Mexico City, about which I showed you the map earlier, where an Armenian, strangely enough, Julfa shows up in 1723 in, of all places, in Acapulco. 1723, traveling there from Manila, with a bizarre name of Don Pedro de Zara, not a typical Julfa name like many of these other Julfa names. And before too long, he's called before the Inquisition in Mexico City, and a person who has snitched on him is none other than, if you can guess it, a fellow Armenian from Iran, whose name is Domingo Guerak-Mirman, who is the head of the Dominican mission in the Yucatan. In Julfa in the Yucatan, and the trial reports of this poor Don Pedro indicate that they say that wherever he goes, he always wears a white hat. He has strange habits, and wherever he goes, he's described as being very cautious of avoiding anyone who's from Iran or anyone, avoiding any Easterners, because for some reason he has a natural kind of caution. And of course, the person who snitches on him is this Domingo Guerak-Mirman, and he says in the court testimony, he says, and I've translated here, he stated that he has said in many conversations that the Armenians who leave Julfa and other countries where there are schismatics and Catholics, in arriving in Catholic countries, claim that they are Catholics because they are allowed to transact and live among them, the Catholics. However, upon returning to their own lands, they declare themselves and live as schismatics, for which reason he has said, that is to say this, Guerak-Mirman, that one cannot trust them who are Catholics even when they say they are such. And because of repeated such examples that have occurred among them, he has said the same thing in regards to the same Don Pedro. So I can't be conclusive, but I would venture to guess that Guerak-Mirman might have also been a ship with two rudders. I'll end here, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Question? Yes, in the back?
I've been in Chicago. Oh, sorry.
You tell me your name before you ask. Yes. Who was it?
Oh, someone behind me.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
Okay. Gregory Gagosian, X from this university, long ago. Been to Chicago too long to look at that map of all the crisscrossing traffic, not to wonder who are their protectors. I mean, if you've got that kind of wealth, aren't there going to be jealous people and erratic folks and just freelance thieves and assorted other people? I haven't heard any mention, and maybe it's not your main interest here. What do they do to protect themselves and their wealth?
Protection. Okay, so your question is partially about protection costs. So yes, this is a major problem for these merchants because when they were engaged in caravan trade, let's say, they have to pay extortion fees for customs and so forth, or they have to hire bodyguards to make sure that their goods were protected and so on. So there were significant problems with protection costs. But unlike the European companies who were engaged in trade at this time, who had their own protection costs in the form of armies and navies and ships that were owned by Canada, the Julfas did not. But in terms of, if your question is, did they have backers in the form of states to protect them?
Not so much that as I've been thinking a lot about ethnic groups that live in places other than their own country. Just what?
Okay. So
How do people who are not part of that manage to exist? There's got to be arrangements worked out, tradition, whatever, that lets them to continue to exist in a not fertile home territory. So if they are merchants going around in lots of places, they are probably not of the places that they perch from time to time.
no, they're going around. They're going around and for the most part being welcome and given hospitality by members of their own community who have these overseas trade posts. So if Hovannisian leaves Julfa to go to Lhasa, Tibet, he doesn't just pick up with no plans and travel on a 10, 15-year journey to Tibet without making any arrangements beforehand and without staying in places where he knows there will be Armenians from Julfa who can host him and who can protect him and who can give him assistance and so forth. So I guess protection would come in the form of community support systems in the larger diaspora itself, the larger nodes of the diaspora. But in terms of armed protection, they had some protection from the states in which they lived. The Armenians who were from, at least the Julfans had initially the strong backing of the Soviet state, but when they were operating in Mughal India and they were living there for longer periods of time, they also had the backing of Mughal rulers. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes.
Thank you for your lecture. Was the openness with which they were greeted a function of the commercial spirit of cooperation? What would be the basis for them to be open to this trade network?
Open in what sense?
You said that they were welcome. They were treated in a salutary fashion as opposed to being viewed as a source of plunder. So what was the basis of that policy of openness towards these merchants?
You mean by the states where they were visiting where they were
Yes.
traveling
Yes.
for transactions and trade?
Yes.
Well, they were welcome because they brought all sorts of benefits. I mean, in Mughal India, they paid taxes. If they lived in Madras and the British, most of them lived in European settlements like Madras, Calcutta, and Surat, and so on. And then to have the privilege of living there, you needed to pay taxes to the East India Company who ruled that. Ruled those lands.
What came first, the fiscal regime or the policy of openness to commerce? Because it seems like if they're mutually reinforcing, what would have to come first, or do they just both pop up at the same time?
I don't quite understand the question.
These merchants were accepted because they could pay taxes and there was some economic utility. But that would presuppose a set of structures, political structures, that would allow that revenue to be possible. So the question is, was the fact that those policies emerged a result of the commercial contact at first that needed to be securitized in this fashion? Or so what, basically a genealogy, what came first?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's always a problem with these chicken egg kind of questions. They probably both were mutually reinforcing. Yes.
Thank you very much for an inspiring lecture. What caught my attention towards the very end of your presentation and regarding different cases of conversion. right, was that you left another that to me seemed very interesting and relevant group outside, and these are the Dorme, the Islamicized Jews of the Ottoman Empire, who seem to somehow be at the very other end of the spectrum. And one could therefore, and this is my question, could one in fact situate your Julfa merchants who converted willingly and consciously and intentionally to Catholicism somewhere in between the conversos and the Marranos, who were facing persecution, and then the Dorme, whose choice was more or less conscious and not forced upon them as followers of Sabbatai Tzvi. I mean, they could have abandoned Sabbatai and maintained the Jewishness without any problem, right?
Sure.
But so this is one part of my question. My second is, and this relates to the two Rudders thing. I mean, it's nice to, I mean, it's always fascinating to talk about hybridity and the playfulness of identities and the way people can do things with them, right? And then play around with them. But I wonder, how can you maintain one identity in one place and be another person in another place, and that be absolutely okay with, if it is not kept a secret from the people in the other place. So if your new Julfa branch of the family in Calcutta doesn't know you're a Catholic in Venice, that's fine. You can still do business with them based on your agnatic structure, right? But if they know about it, isn't then the bond kind of dissolved?
Interesting question. I like the first one particularly. Both are very interesting. Thank you for them. The first one, I should have mentioned this myself because there's always a problem when one analogizes from one community to another. And I do think that there's remarkable parallels with Sephardim. My work is based on a comparative analysis of Armenians, Sephardim, and Greeks. So the Sephardim are the ones that are the closest in some ways to the Julfans, or the Julfans are the closest to them in some ways. But of course, the problem with analogizing is that sometimes in our quest to find similarity as global historians, we often tend to undermine or minimize difference. And here I should have made it very clear. There are parallels, but the most important difference, of course, is that in the case of the communities I mentioned earlier, the conversos, the Marranos or the Moriscos and others, the conversion is forced, right? It is on pain of death, collective conversion. In the case of these Julfans, particularly the one in Don Pedro or Mexico or Guerak-Mirman even, it's not really forced in the sense of there's no violence involved. There is compulsion because one has to convert Catholicism if one wants to build an Armenian church and have it be in the Armenian right. But so there is a kind of compulsion. There's no force or coercion. So there the difference I think is important, and maybe in that sense, maybe they are kind of typologically between the followers of Sabbatai Tzvi, although he himself was not voluntarily, but his followers, and maybe the other spectrum, the other end of the spectrum with the Marranos. So, as far as the second question is concerned, how did you're essentially saying how did the apostolic members of the Guerak-Mirman family deal with their cousins who were Catholics?
Yeah, well, how do you keep a secret within a network and still maintain a network?
Well, you're assuming that the Catholic converts are actually sincere with quotation mark converts.
I'm not assuming
if both parties know that one party has converted because of instrumental reasons, then I can't imagine that they would hold it against them. But I don't know. I mean, the document that this is a whole area of scholarship that isn't even on the radar. So it deserves more program. Thank you. Yes, I'll go here first.
you mentioned that, I don't know whether it was here or in your book, that the Armenians also traded in Burma. The French were there at the same time, too, before the English. Well, evidently not before the Armenians. So I just want to ask you an off-the-wall question, unrelated to the main thrust of your talk. Do you know what the Armenians call the country, Burma? What is the form that they use to refer to?
It's a tough question. The Burmese community has practically not been examined or explored before. The documents we have about Burma are very few and far in between. The earliest document I have seen in Julfa about Burma involving the Julfa is from Rangoon. I think it's called Yangon at that time, but I'm not sure. It's in 1757. It's in the Hague records of the East India Company. But the other documentation is from the 19th century, and I couldn't really say because we don't have that much testimony, first-person evidence, primary source material from the 19th century.
I asked you, it's a bit of an etymological detective work, because the French, of course, named Burma Guerak, after the wrote it with an I-R. The British came and showed their Royal Society, which is a U-R, because that was a more common spelling of the syllable, which became the middle of the word. And now, of course, the name has been changed to Myanmar, something like Myanmar. I was listening to a TV program about the time when Aung San Suu Kyi had been released and was jousting with the generals. And what I heard from the speakers of Burmese on the program was something like Yama, Yama, Yama. And there is a region in the center. I'm not sure whether it's a city, more like an area or a people, which became the dominant proto-ruling class about that time, in the late 1600s, when the French and the Armenians were trading, called something like Guerak. And I'm guessing that Yema and Guerak are in fact the same word. Because these labials are very indistinct, and you can easily mistake them at a distance of listening. Ba and ba. And the following phonemes are pretty much identical. So I was just hoping for a bit of confirmation.
Yeah, that's actually a fascinating detail for me. I wish I could have answered it. If you had asked me in the ideal world, what did the Armenians call Chinsura, right? The settlement north of Calcutta. I think it's north, but I'm not sure. It's a 20-minute drive from Calcutta. What did the Armenians call this place? It was known as Chinsura. Some is Chinsura in English. That I could have answered because I have documents, and there it was said they called it Chichla. And it's very close to the actual native name, which is Chichura.
But people who first met these,
I'm afraid I have this information.
they were just imitating what they
Hripsime?
Thank you very much, of course, for this very fascinating story of the family. And my question would be about the family. So Hovhannis goes to somewhere very far away for so many years. So leaves the family, the wife. We were talking about patriarchal framework of the family. So what would the wife do? So will she subjugated to like the brothers' law? So what happens there? And the son is just saying, so he would maybe not see, for instance, his sons for 10 years, 15 years.
Yeah.
Do we have any specifics there, any details about the people left behind?
Excellent question again. It's one of those days when I'm not going to be satisfying in my responses. I would suspect that the wife who would be left behind would be subject to the oldest brother's authority. But I don't have any documentation for that, or I can't really, I can maybe say perhaps and so on in the absence, in the gaps, instead of the broken fabric, the torn fabric that is history. I can maybe fill those gaps by saying perhaps or what if and so on, but I'm a historian, so I can't. But one thing I can say is that my own partner, my better half, has written an excellent essay on the consequences of this kind of patriarchy in Julfa itself, because when the male agents fanned out across the world to conduct trade for their masters, they left behind their sisters and so on, and wives. And so at some point, New Julfa actually was probably the majoritarian women's society, because most of the men were away at work. And so the question she asked is, what happens when you have this kind of society, when the men are away at work? What kind of impact does it have on women's ability to have agency and to conduct transactions and engage in kinds of trade that are usually exclusively reserved for men? And she argues that with evidence that, in fact, the other side of patriarchy is that it engenders agency for women because they're actually left behind and they're selling property because their husbands aren't there. They're petitioning the courts and so forth, doing things that usually men were supposed to do. And we do have records for that because we have dozens and dozens of petitions to the children's court involving property deeds or disputes and so on. They were the ones who were engaged in it because the men weren't there. So, at least 100, maybe 60 to 100 letters written by women, wives, daughters, and so forth, to their agents, to their family members, and loved ones who were circulating. So this is quite unusual because, at least as far as the Middle East is concerned, there aren't that many letters written by women that have survived in the 17th and 16th centuries, 17th and 18th centuries. But in this case, we do have that. Maybe also as a result of the unintended consequences of patriarchy.
We have two questions in the back, and then I think we're going to have to give our speaker a break. It's always possible to ask him questions over the reception.
Yes.
So, did any offspring of this particular family,
Did
any offspring of this particular family or any other Armenian merchant family get educated in Roman colleges at the time?
Yes.
Because okay, because this also can complicate somehow this religious allegiance issue, I'm supposing. So, could you?
Yeah, good question. Of course they did. I don't know how many of them, but I can tell you that the other family that often gets the lion's share of attention. And by that I don't mean they're like lions of historians waiting to be. There are like one or two people interested in them. And the other family is the Hripsime family, also Catholic Armenians, also from Julfa, and like the Guerak-Mirman, also involved, but more heavily in the diamond and gem trade. They're very devout Catholics, to the extent that we can say anybody is devout. And in that case, we know that one of their sons, a 10-year-old named Basilio, was sent from Iran in 1690-something to the Collegio Urbano in Rome, where he entered to the urban college of Rome to be educated in theology, philosophy, and so forth, and he went on to become a Monsignor. So there are cases as far as how many Julfan families have children, and schools in Rome, in the propaganda schools, or in the Collegio Armenian in Rome, I can't say, but there are some cases, yes. Cornell.
Thank you, Sebouh, very much for this.
I'm not seeing it's you.
It is me, yes. Thank you so much. Just really, I guess, an observation to which I'd like your reaction on the subject of conversions, group or individual, and how they were perceived. I think one of the problems that I have with the sort of importation of essentially Western and Northern European models or discussions of confessionalization to the Middle Eastern context is that I don't think it entirely works. It looks like it should work, but it really doesn't. And one of the things that being focused on the Ottoman Empire, the Mamluk Empire, and the 16th and 17th centuries, even more so the 15th century, shows one is actually how common, for all kinds of reasons, conversion was. I mean, starting in the 15th century in the Balkans and in Anatolia, people know that there are lots of people going back and forth, right? And indeed, I mean, I think that the received wisdom on the Ottoman child levy, the Devshirme, and all that holds that the point of this system of formal enslavement was to uproot, deracinate people from their natal communities. And what I see is that, quite the contrary, they're valued because of what their natal communities are, and maintaining those ties. And it's not necessarily a problem until you get the regional inquisitions, for example, for somebody to have had a captivity experience, whatever, in Egypt or in Ottoman lands, and 30 years later wants to go home, but he's not going to go home after having a very nice career as a Muslim. He's not going to go home until he gets a bull from the Pope guaranteeing that he's not going to get trouble from the Inquisition. So what I'm trying to say is that it seems to me that the talk about confessionalization, and it takes very peculiarly sort of hard-edged shapes and dimensions in the Western Mediterranean, obscures, going back to some of the questions that you were asking, okay, the possible effects of, I mean, I probably made the figure up, but I somehow came up with the figure that in the 16th and 17th centuries, probably one family in every 5 was personally affected by some sort of experience of conversion. And it's not necessarily, unless you have the sort of situation that you have in Iberia, the kind of utterly life-shattering, changing experience that we tend to think of it as being when affected particularly by greater or lesser means of coercion. So I just offer that on those.
I don't think I mentioned confessionalization, although I should have, because I am.
You did actually at the beginning, so my ears perked up.
So certainly, I think that the confessionalization thesis is problematic in its mechanical application outside of the European, its European cradle, perhaps. But I think I find merit in the idea of confessionalism, right? Confessionalization and such. And I do think that in the case of at least the Armenians I study in the Ottoman Empire, confessionalism is very important because if to the extent that you believe that the Ottoman state, if you believe in the Tirana Kristic and Derin Terzioglu's take on things which I find somewhat compelling, then you would see that the local communities, such as the Armenians, the Greeks, and so on, or even the Jews, have their own version of a kind of internalized confessionalization strife. And if you look at the 1690s in Istanbul, early 1700s, in the Armenian community, confessionalization is everything. It's extreme. The Armenian community is torn apart on confessional strife, and of course, Catholic Armenians take the brunt of this. But in the Armenian case, unlike maybe the Ottoman case and the European case, confessionalization or confessionalism is something that continues until the late 1700s, until the early 1900s. So that would be the one modification I would make. But there's certainly a kind of internalized model of confessional strife because of the hardening of religious boundaries, religious distinctions and boundaries and so on. In terms of forced conversion, the Inquisition and the Iberian Peninsula, that of course is not the case in the Ottoman Empire as far as I know, or anywhere else. I think Iberia is somewhat unique in that sense. And that even there, it predates confessionalism by 50 years.
Sure, and if I could just add something, I mean, I agree with you, and within various flavors of Muslim communities, one can see that by the 17th century, establishing an identity or declaring an identity can have a valence that it didn't have in, say, the 15th or the early 16th centuries. But I would just, I guess the other part of my problem with using the term confessionalism too much is that it also obscures a prior period when the churches are falling apart. There's one solution in Iberia, which is not necessarily the same solution that is sought in Geneva or other places, let alone Venice, for that matter, until rather later on. But rather a world in which people can actually imagine that maybe all of these confessional divides they're just going to pass away. Maybe they're historically conditioned accretive phenomenon, and in a new golden age, who cares? Maybe some people care, or there may be divine providential intervention will make all the Jews see the error of their ways, and all the Muslims see the error of their ways, and become Christians. But there's also, there's also a lived reality of highly mixed families and households in these regions. So I'm
going to say, let's carry this on.
Yeah.
Yeah.